Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, it appears that China once again has the U.S. over a barrel as the lauded trade deal reached in Geneva between Beijing and the U.S. has many elements that are strongly beneficial to China.
Yeah, absolutely. The reason we're doing this today is because, as usual, and I hate to have to say it, but it's true. There's a development somewhere. The Trump administration comes out with a version of that development that, frankly, has very little basis in reality. And this ongoing sort of tariff trade war, technology war with the Chinese is something we've discussed previously. It was going on in Trump 1.0 and it's been going on in Trump 2.0. And the US came out with all guns blazing, this very cavalier approach that we're going to stick massive tariffs on Chinese imports. And oh dear, China responded in kind. And then we increased them. Oh, and they responded in kind again. And in the end, they made tariffs so high that as far as the United States was concerned, they couldn't export any goods to China anymore. And then that was the point where they put the brakes on, restored what it was prior to the sort of April the 2nd debacle, so-called Liberation Day, which no one talks about anymore because it didn't liberate anything. And then, of course, there's this much vaunted 9th of July deadline, which is now apparently no longer a deadline because it can get extended. Or Trump goes, I'd like to not extend. I'd like to actually shorten the deadline. But the truth is they've scrapped it because no one signed any deals. I mean, they keep going on about how we're going to have hundreds of deals, even though there wasn't hundreds of nations on the planet. And then it became 100, then it became dozens, and now it's, oh, maybe 10 or 12 because the whole thing's a flop. It's failed. And with regards to China, there was a statement came out from the Americans and the lack of any response whatsoever, never mind formal response from the Chinese, for me, May was very telling in that there was a claim from the Americans that the Chinese had signed this deal with the Americans, which would have been on the 24th, which is supposed to, they say, codify the terms laid out in trade talks between Beijing and Washington. Well, from what I understood, there was no agreement reached in those talks whatsoever. Yes, there was an American claim, and we'll come on to that shortly, about this commitment from China to deliver rare earths. And then we'll look at what actually those deliveries are, because the US gave the impression they're going to give us everything, whether it's commercial, whether it's civilian, whether it's for military uses. And of course, that is absolutely not the case. And I think it was Lutnick came out and said in an interview, they're going to deliver rare earths, and then we're going to take down our countermeasures. Well, basically, what countermeasures were in place was pretty minimal anyway, given they'd stripped all of them back after, of course, that initial April the 2nd statement. Now, it's one thing the White House coming out saying the US and China had agreed to implement some Geneva Accord. Well, there was a request for a comment from the Chinese embassy in Washington, who said nothing, declined to do so, and China's foreign ministry in Beijing didn't respond for a request either. So you have to immediately start to say, well, what actually has been agreed? And what you can say is, and the United States really should have understood this before any of this nonsense happened, that without rare earths, the United States is in serious, serious trouble, both commercially and for civilian applications in a broader sense, but also militarily, they're in serious trouble. How someone didn't explain to them their dependence on these refined rare earths from China beggars belief. I mean, and China made a point to the United States to have any form of meaningful discussion in the future, not whatever this interim agreement is or isn't, will be that all existing measures would have to be removed, go back to a level playing field, and let's reach some sort of agreement. Well, China has partially agreed to lifting the measures, and we'll come on to the rare earths in a minute. But basically, most of those conditions are still in place. And the other point is, in return for doing that, what the United States hasn't mentioned is what was China's demands in doing so. And I'll give way to you, Ken, and then we can come back to this.
Yeah, one of the most I don't want to say ironic, but more humorous things that came out of this was, I believe it may have been Lutnick, but I thought it was Besant who made the point of, oh, well, we've got to, some of these trade deals are going to be extended, not to July 9th deadline, but to September. And I saw you had tweeted out sort of an ironic thing like, yeah, pretty soon it's going to be like the 39th of October or something like that, just
Yes.
some arbitrary point. They keep pushing this out because the reality is that very few of these trade deals are actually getting done. And one of the important points being made as well, is that the president seems to be dictating trade terms. There's no such thing as negotiations. They call it negotiations, but really, Trump wants to dictate terms the same way he's dictating terms in his foreign policy. And because of this, there might be, we had a complete breakdown of the trade agreements or the discussions, negotiations with Canada the last couple of days. So him and
Yeah.
Carney are complete opposition. So really, when all these wild promises and wins that they keep claiming in the media from everybody in the administration, more and more you have to take a look at the fact that very few of these deals are getting made. They're just calling it a win and then moving on to the next thing.
Well, yeah, and that's been symptomatic of Trump 2.0. But let's get into the meat of this because people in the US and other parts of the world genuinely believe that China's going to allow the United States to have full access to rare earths via exports, and that somehow, don't worry, because the United States can replicate all this rare earth production in the blink of an eye. Well, let's look at this. China has been consolidating that industry for a very long time. And what China has done prior to any agreement in inverted commas that's now being reached basically was making sure that they had strict export controls in place for both rare earths and technologies. I mean, China's already making measures to prevent anybody trying to smuggle technology out or rare earths out of China. It's also worth noting, even the Americans came out and admitted it would probably take 2 decades for the United States to diversify its rare earth supply chains away from its dependence on China and other critical minerals, other critical resources. Now, what is China actually offering the United States? Not exclusively, but also it's Europe and Japan, as you mentioned before we came on air, Ken. They're relaxing export control on some civilian usage to do with magnets, and that's for the EU, Japan, and the United States. Also, the volume allowed is very limited. They're going to give them 6 months, and if they don't behave themselves in totality within that 6 months, then the deal gets torn up and you get nothing. And that still has to go through approval as well. And also, the other thing is if you have any diversion of materials to applications different from what's on the application itself, then they're going to, in future, no more applications will be processed for those individuals or companies, whoever it might be. The other thing is military use of rare earths is still strictly forbidden for export. It's not happening. So China's been very clear, and they will follow this forensically. So if the idea is you have some company, there's actually a front for the US military, and they're shipping rare earths in, and then they get shipped off to another address and utilized for the military. As soon as they find out that, which they will do very easily, then it's over. They won't get those rare earths, and the chances are China will just pull the drawbridge up and say you're having absolutely nothing. Now, this is on a 6 monthly basis, which can be renewed or might not be renewed. But if the United States doesn't play ball, then, and Europe for that matter, or anyone else, then they will just say, sorry, you're not having any rare earths whatsoever. Now, that will cause immense amount of damage for the United States' economy, for its ability to produce any goods whatsoever. And from a military perspective, given they're forbidden to utilize it, they can't produce enormous amounts of weapons. Now, let's bear in mind that the United States is trying to produce weapons to give to Israel. They are also trying to produce weapons to give to Ukraine. I mean, they've got to the point with Ukraine, there's just nothing left to give them. And there's no doubt, given what's happened with the recent conflict between the Israelis and the Iranians, they expanded an awful lot of missiles in defending Israel. So they're very low on supplies. We've talked about that previously. That is going to be a huge problem that's not going to go away. So China's making sure they're trying to curtail the United States' ability to rearm anyone in the process. And the US knows this very, very clearly, that if they take any steps in the wrong direction, China will immediately, and they're not soft like the Russians and trying to be accommodating. They will just immediately pull the drawbridge up and it's game over. And then another point worth making is, what does China really get in return for all this? Because it's nothing to do with tariffs. And oh, we're reducing the percentage or to 20% or something like that. China is demanded the United States to basically walk away from Taiwan, stop meddling, stop arming them, stop pretending you agree with the one China principle, and then doing the exact opposite. You walk away in totality and you do not stir up tensions in the broader Indo-Pacific, as they like to call it, the United States region, or Asia Pacific, as everyone else says. And that's the condition. And if they also continue to do that, then the rare earth deal's off also. And China leveraged this heavily. So the United States basically went from being in a position where they went, oh, well, we're calling the shots, thinking, oh, we're in charge, we're going to stick it to the Chinese. And the US has had to capitulate, and China's basically issued them stern ultimatums. If you don't play ball and go along with what we're saying, then any agreement that's in place will immediately be null and void, basically.
I think there's a really big point that most people overlook. This isn't just simply about raw rare earth minerals. Okay. The United States has access to many of them from other different sources. But the reality is that China does 90% of the refining of rare earth minerals and then sells out the refined product. Well, for for the United States or Europe or anybody else to suddenly have to create an industry to be able to refine rare earths will take 1 to 2 decades. And it's something that actually is relatively toxic. So, do you think the environmental policies of the West would allow them to even do this? No. That's why China has the upper hand in all of this, because it's all about the refining, not necessarily about access to the raw minerals.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. I mean, there is a big thing that the rare earths aren't really that rare, and that's true, although we have to be careful what we mean by that. But you're absolutely right in principle. That's exactly the problem. It's the refinement of these rare earths. But it's not just rare earths, it's other minerals, other resources the US is massively dependent on China for. And the other thing, of course, is China is already decoupling from the United States. We've talked about that previously. We don't need to repeat it. And there's no evidence that China's going to go back and then say, well, we're not going to import soybeans from Brazil anymore. We're going to go back to the United States. That ship sailed and it's not going to happen. And of course, the other thing that is happening, which is causing the United States huge problems, is the amount of capital inflows into China that is actually to the detriment of the United States. And that is likely to continue. And China can arguably could go some way to alleviate that problem by not encouraging businesses to pull out of the United States, which they have done, and China to continue to dump US treasuries and China to dump dollar denominated assets. So China has huge leverage over the US. The US is in no position whatsoever to dictate anything, and they should have realized this. Uh, Countries like the US have seem to believe that if you have the world's reserve currency, that you have a totally dominant position. And there was a time when it worked for them, but that time's long since gone, and it's no longer the case, and it will never be the case again in the future. And of course, the other thing that the US is having to factor into its thinking is massively dependent on Russia, and it wants to make friends with Russia in the future, and that's a whole separate subject for another day. And this isn't just this is to do with oil and gas production as well, and a lot of critical resources the United States needs. I mean, just look at refined uranium being an obvious example. The US doesn't, in any way, shape, or form, have uranium enrichment. It seemingly has forgotten how to do it or just doesn't do it. But the only problem with that is the US has always been trying to say to the Russians, well, you better be in our camp and you better ditch the Chinese. Well, that's never going to happen. So the other thing, of course, that we have to stack on into this equation is if the United States persists in trying to stab China in the back and failing, of course, that is going to also affect their ability to have a normal relationship with the Russians. And therefore, if they want normal relations with the Russians and to benefit from all the things they'd like to benefit from in terms of investment, oil and gas production, etc., then the Chinese come as part of that package, and you're going to have to treat them in a civilized way and work for mutual cooperation. Because if you don't, we won't work with you either. So the US has an awful lot to think about, but what the Trump administration is now trying to do is just convince everyone that a world exists that doesn't, and that rather like what happened with Iran, we went and bombed and destroyed all these nuclear sites, which they didn't. It's always about optics. It's always about news flow and thinking, well, in 24 hours we'll be on to something else. We've told everyone this and everyone believes it. But increasingly, many Trump supporters don't believe it either. And this is why there's been this gigantic split in the so-called MAGA movement. And they need to start dealing with realities and also realize the days of going out and trying to bully nations is over, but particularly with China. And China is not going to tolerate it. And China is very happy to put very strict measures in place that can cause the United States a world of pain. And whether Americans want to believe this, frankly, I don't care because it's reality. And they only have to look at the big climb down by the US to realize that that is indeed a reality.
I think last thing to touch on here is in regards to what trade uh, will be now that China has set up a redeemable yuan in gold. Because one of the more important things that's going to happen is that the U.S. has been reliant upon all nations doing trade with them in dollars and dollars alone. Well, if China is opening up more opportunity, and we talked about this in a podcast a couple days ago, that China is expanding the yuan internationally, that more and more bilateral trade that is taking place in the yuan. Well, now that it's going to be redeemable in gold, if the United States doesn't want to play ball, all China has to do is say, you know what, we're not going to accept dollars anymore. We're going to trade solely in yuan or in gold, one of the two. And if the US balks, well, China has many more and growing trade partners to make up the slack of what they've been trading the US. And guess what? The US needs China and Russia far more than those two countries need the US.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a hugely important point. And, you know, people have made comments for a number of years. And I wouldn't say we're at that point. And this, of course, may never happen. But you can't rule out the day if the United States tries to play hardball the Chinese, that the Chinese turn around and go, well, the only way we're prepared to trade with you is if you will trade in the yuan and not the dollar. And people will just simply go, that's impossible. Well, it's not impossible. You cannot rule it out. I'm not ruling it in at the moment. I'm not saying it's a fait accompli because it isn't. But it's something the United States has to take seriously. Because if it does come to the point, China will happily walk away and say, okay, totally decoupling from you. Unless you actually play ball, win-win cooperation, mutual benefit, and learn to show respect for other nations, meaning, well, obviously China in this case. If they don't, China will walk away and have no problem doing it.
And I think on top of that is the fact that where the US and Europe have created a consumer-based economy. Everything's based on consumer spending. In China, that's a limited thing. That's a low percentage. Their economy is based mostly on exports. So if, and I think the one of the members of the PBOC mentioned this before, is that going forward, we're going to cultivate more domestic production and consumerism. So if they end up having to lessen their exports, especially the United States, they can always have that buffer zone to increase domestic spending by consumers, even though the Chinese people are savers for the most part. Expanding it even 1/5, a small percentage is going to make up the slack of what they lose if they end up cutting the U.S. off export wise.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, any other thoughts you had
No, I
on this,
think no, I
Paul?
think that's a good point to stop.
Absolutely. Well, everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you as always for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.